CASCADE is investigating tipping points in ecosystems, how they can be detected or prevented. This is very important because it may involve abrupt shifts from one state to another that is irreversible. And this is the case, for example, with desertification, when such shifts can occur because of overgrazing or drought or the occurrence of fires. We use computer models in this project to explore which mechanisms can lead to this kind of catastrophic dynamics. And this is important because by that we can explore the conditions for which those dynamics can be expected. And this is essential to understand this kind of dynamics and also to predict when this kind of dynamics can occur. For example, in the case of desertification, we know that plant biomass can increase the infiltration of rainwater into the soil, making the soil better. And this kind of mechanisms can lead to catastrophic dynamics, which we can calculate. And by that we can know, for example, for which soil types we can expect desertification as a consequence of overgrazing. These models are practically relevant because we can calculate management scenarios. For example, the occurrence of grazing or fire or wood cutting. And we can calculate when it can lead to catastrophic dynamics or when it can prevent catastrophic dynamics. The other practical use is the detection of early warning signals, so that we can see beforehand how close we are to a threshold. And these models are also important for restoration measures. Once the system is very degraded, what measures to take to restore the system. This here is a very nice example of how plants can improve water infiltration. Because if rainfall occurs, the water will fall on the ground, but it will run off from the bare ground because it cannot infiltrate. But here on the shrub, the infiltration rate is very high and the water can infiltrate, and this causes also the lush vegetation under the shrub, while nothing is growing on the bare soil. I can give 3 examples of models that are being developed in the project. One example is about desertification and how drought and overgrazing can lead to these catastrophic shifts and when this occurs. The other model is about forest fires, in which we can predict what happens with the ecosystem after the abandonment of land. And the system can develop either in a very healthy state with trees that are fire resistant, or in a lot of shrubs that are fire prone and fires will occur again and again. And a third example of a model I can give is that we study how plant interactions occur and how that affects catastrophic shifts in relation to drought and overgrazing.
Oh yeah. This is typically the type of vegetation that we're trying to study. You can see here that there are areas where there is some vegetation, the vegetation patches, and areas where there is no vegetation, where only bare soil. Now, if you go and look in the vegetation patches, what you can see is that the young plants are over there. And that's because the plants, they create better conditions for new plants to come in. That's what we call the local facilitation mechanism. That's what our models are trying to describe. They're trying to understand how the mechanisms of interaction between the plants and between the plants and the soil create those patterns, and how that can help us understand these ecosystem degradation. How do these ecosystems degrade, and what are the reasons for that? One of the things that we're trying to study with our models is what can we learn from those patterns? If we look at the patterns in nature, do they tell us anything about how degraded an ecosystem is? Now we include different types of precise mechanisms to give us some hints on which mechanisms are important for degradation and how close we are from a tipping point.
So this is the typical patchy landscape that you can find in a dryland ecosystem. And this patchiness of the vegetation makes that water does not infiltrate the same everywhere. So it is higher below the plant patches and it is lower in the bare soil areas in between the patches. So when vegetation cover is removed beyond a threshold because of overgrazing or an extreme drought, the amount of bare soil areas is higher, but more importantly, the spatial connectivity of those bare soil areas is much higher and more resources are being lost from the system. In this way, the vegetation that remains cannot grow normally or new plants cannot establish, and vegetation is further reduced and the amount of runoff and resources that are being lost is further increased, completing a feedback loop that ends in a degraded state. Including these eco-hydrological feedbacks in our models is important in order to better predict how and when tipping points may happen. And understanding the impact of the spatial distribution of the vegetation in the behavior of the system can also help us to better design strategies to restore areas that are already degraded.
So, by using computer simulations, we can investigate how vegetation pattern develops over time. And we can use this to see how different types of pressure, like aridity or grazing, have an effect on the vegetation. So, this is what the model simulations look like in the computer. We can see the vegetation patches in black and the bare soil in white between them. And we can use this model now to simulate what happens if grazing pressure is increased. You see that the vegetation cover disappears abruptly, and even if we reduce the grazing pressure to its original low level, it is not able to recover. So this is what we call a tipping point. We can use this model to simulate and to see how far we can push the system before it collapses, and to develop sustainable land use management strategies.
My model was inspired from the ecosystems in the east of Spain, where in the ancient time the whole peninsula of Spain and in general most of the Mediterranean was covered by forest, mostly composed by this oak, which is a Quercus ilex. But then the human came and started cutting tree to have cultivated land, and that process lasted for about 1,000 years at least. But on the top of this natural process of recovering of the forest, fires come. And the fire, of course, burn most of the trees, and the question that my model is trying to answer, combined with experimental observation, is can the fires arrest this process of succession and of recovery of the forest, and can the fire lock the system into this state that we consider degraded because it's composed mostly of shrubs and it's not very biodiverse. And the model result seems to indicate that yes, the forest will come back. So this oak is very strong and can resist fire, so they will come back, but it may take a very long time. We are not likely to see it. It may take a couple of generations for these oaks, which could be around 1,000 years. The model indicates that in the very long run the oak forest will recover and it will be close again, and the system will look as in the old time. But these times are very long, so for the moment all these lands are still covered by shrublands and they burn very often. So the indication that the model gives for management practice is that the management could help the oak forest to come back, planting eventually oak seedlings. And the oak forest it's much less flammable than the shrublands that we currently have, and therefore the fires will be less and less frequent, and that will help, the planting actually will help speeding up the recovery of the forest.
In my model, we are simulating the growth of two different plant species and the water content in the soil underneath those plants. For example, when you take this shrub, it is taking up water from the soil, and therefore, for other species growing down here, it is negative. It's negative to grow there because they are outcompeted. On the other hand, this shrub is providing shade, as you can see here. And it's also protecting against herbivores, so therefore it might be positive to grow underneath the shrub. So you have negative impacts and positive impacts of a plant growing here or further away from the shrub. And with my model, we are trying to calculate at what drought stress level and what grazing stress level it is still good for a plant to grow underneath a shrub, or at what stress level it is better to grow further away from the shrub. For replantation techniques, it might provide answers on whether you should plant in the vicinity of another plant or further away from another plant.